Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 379. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the highly talented and nationally recognized Vermont author of Usurpation, Mimi Yahn.
Thank you. I am honored to be here, actually.
Yeah. So it's fun. Before we start recording, so your nom de plume is Marie Sampe.
Marie Sampe, that's right. Yes.
Yep.
And Usurpation is the debut novel for Marie Sampe.
Yes. But you're also, because that's your author plume. But you've been writing stuff all for a while under Mimi Yahn for a long time.
Yeah. Although primarily what's been published has been nonfiction. Even though I've written a lot of stories, a lot of fiction, what I'm known for is investigative reporting, for essays. I don't know how well known, but and some scholarship as well, some scholarly articles. In fact, I did have a website. I still technically have it, but it broke because I couldn't keep up with all of the updates. And so at some point I need to rebuild that website called decolonizingourhistory.com. And that's where a lot of my scholarship was, and as well as academia.com. But Fiction is really my first love, and I'm very happy to be getting back into it. Really happy to be getting back into it.
Yeah, and so this book, as we met, is actually, as of this recording, was just released a couple days ago, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So basically, it's like when you look at the, I love the description. When her best friend's son is murdered, Kitty Feliz uncovers a racist scheme involving drug gangs, police corruption, and the gentrification through the deliberate blighting of Black communities. Spanning two cities, Portland, Oregon, and New Orleans, Usurpation tells an emotional story of hardship and redemptive love through the lives of two families and through the eyes of Kitty, whose experiences and musings as a Black lesbian lyrically link the personal with the political and the heart with the mind. It sounds like that's a lot to do, but it's over 450 pages. So
462. Yeah. It's a saga. And, I think the subject deserves a saga.
Right.
And some of it is my writing process. I love to write stories. And so these two families, this part of it is their histories, stories from each of their families. So there are some digressions, but it's all about telling this story. And it's also primarily told through dialogue. I love dialogue. That's my favorite way to move a story forward, is through dialogue. And I got very, very much into this, writing about this. It was very personal to me, actually. Part of it is because I lived in Portland and New Orleans in the 90s, which is when the book takes place. And I saw this gentrification beginning, particularly in Portland, Oregon, in the historically Black district, Albina. I saw the beginnings of it and saw what it was doing to the neighborhood. The foreclosures were starting, and now Portland is completely transformed. It's just, to me, it's an unlivable city. It is incredibly expensive. I don't know how anybody can actually live there. And it went from being a very quiet town, really a town, to just high rises and very much gentrification everywhere. Many people were forced out, frankly.
Right.
And so, this was, and I saw it happening in New Orleans as well. I mean, gentrification happens periodically, but I saw this latest one. And I actually started writing the novel in the 90s, but life kept interfering. I kept putting it aside and kept waiting for someone else to tell this story. And nobody seemed like nobody was. And then the most that I could find was people talking about how things in the 2000s, how things started, but it really began before that. And this, I really felt this was a really, really important story to tell.
What other similarities do you see that the two cities have culturally?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know. They're very different. They're
Hmm.
very different cities. In fact, it's sort of there's a little bit of a theme that runs through it where the protagonist, the woman who narrates it, Kitty Feliz, lives in Portland, but her heart is really in New Orleans. It's a very, very different kind of place. And she's sort of torn. Um, people keep trying to urge her family down in New Orleans, wants her to move there, and but she doesn't want to give up her life in Portland yet. And a lot of it has to do with the way that Black women and the way lesbians are treated. And this was the 90s, so things were quite different. We really take certain things for granted, particularly about homosexuality. And in the 90s, things were kind of scary. Lesbians were nearly invisible in New Orleans. People just didn't, there were no clubs, no bars for women any longer. And in Portland at the time, there was only one. And there was, unfortunately, the 90s is when there was a lot of things going on, skinheads, but one of the things that happened was one of the first anti-gay initiatives was introduced by this group called the Oregon Citizens Alliance, and it became quite ugly. It was really it went on for a number of years, and they kept introducing initiative, propositions. Each time it got closer and closer to passing. So, like the last one that they introduced would have banned gays from teaching, from adopting children, from a whole bunch of things. I mean, it was really incredibly homophobic. But
Hmm.
finally, the forces of good prevailed, and but there was always that undercurrent. And of course, we had the skinheads. So there was a lot of racist violence, and it was at times very scary. And it was definitely a time of change. What I also saw the beginnings of was the hipster culture, which
Hmm.
I really see as a product driven. It's an interesting thing about hipsterism. It really seems to have been created by, well, Apple, for one, and other corporations. I think it's really the only subculture that was not indigenous to anything. It was created, um, and and I saw the beginnings of that very hyper consumerist, hipster, product driven culture that was beginning, and it's really taken it. It's Portland is really very much part of that now.
Hmm.
So yeah. It was really sad to see these changes.
How do you see your experience writing nonfiction and some journalism pieces that prepared you to write this this
Yeah.
epic saga?
Well, all of my writing is in service of my politics, to be honest. I really feel, I mean, I have a CD, I've written songs. I used to do a lot of singing, so singer songwriter, and all of my songs are political. Um, and my writing has always been political. To me, that's the reason why I do it. I love doing it. I mean, I go crazy if I don't write.
Hmm.
It's my art, but what really fuels me is the commitment to social justice, and so this was just simply another way of doing it. Um, a way that for me is more enjoyable. Um, and I think the only reason I got away from it was because in the 90s, when I was writing a lot of short stories, it was not a good time for women. And stories that featured women, that were about women's lives, were just simply not, editors didn't want to publish them. And I got discouraged. I gave up and I switched to just writing articles and political things like that. And but a few years ago, I really wanted to. I actually had been wanting to get back to fiction for a long time, and I finally did. Starting by picking up the novel again and finally finishing it.
And how was it different picking it back up again? Whereas you're rereading it so many years later.
Yeah.
Did you read it and you're like, oh yeah, I got to change this, or did you think, I got to edit this out, or I got to add more to this? I got to explain, because now you have more experience as a
Yes.
writer
Right.
since you looked at it
Yeah.
last time.
Yeah. No, actually, what really shocked me was that there was very little that needed to be changed. I fully expected that there was going to be a lot of editing. I was really surprised. I didn't need to. I mean, I guess I was really inspired by, um, I have several things that happen when I write. One of them is that I write on a longhand and on a typewriter when I'm doing fiction. Because what happens is that there's just this full body experience that happens that doesn't happen on the computer. And the computer is more mechanical. So the creative part of my brain doesn't really get fully engaged the way it does when I'm just typing away on a manual typewriter or writing longhand. So there's that spark, there's that just energy that happens. And another thing, I don't know where this came from, but when I started putting this novel together, I was living in New Orleans, and the Times-Picayune, the main paper there, the daily there, always they had the obituary section, and they had photographs of people alongside their obituaries, and the names were just extraordinary. So I started cutting these out, and then when I really got serious about writing the novel, I went through this file and I picked out photographs for the characters, and I would hang them up over my desk. So I've got the picture of Lima and Peepaw and all of these, Olivie, and all of them. I've got them all, the pictures, and then when I had to put it away because I had moved or it was just like I kept moving all over the place, and I think I was moving to Pittsburgh at that point. And then finally, I mentioned earlier that I'd been diagnosed with cancer about, it was like 5.5 years ago, I guess. And I knew I needed to get back to it. And I pulled out that file and I pulled out those photos that were in these plastic protecting sleeves. And it was just, I was overwhelmed with this feeling of love. It was like my family. I was pulling the pictures of my family out, and it's just like, oh. And so that really made a huge difference. I mean, I would look at them and and keep writing, and I just had their faces in my head. And then another part of it was music. There's a lot of music involved in the story. Several of the characters are musicians. And I actually have an unofficial soundtrack. So there were certain scenes that involved music, or it was, a particular piece was played. And so I would put that on. When I was writing the scene, I would put on that piece of music and just dance and then sit down and write. But just really sparked the creativity. It was like I was right there in the moment of that particular scene that I was writing. And the music was a huge part of it. So, yeah, I mean, everything about creative writing, fiction writing for me is just, it opens up so much more than just the intellectual nonfiction.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. Thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. So as we mentioned, the book itself is of over 460 pages.
Yeah.
Did you, was it larger? How much did you have to edit down?
I kind of debated about that. I could have edited down a lot, and I'm sure any editor would have decided to throw out a whole bunch of it. But I decided I want this to be a saga, and I want
Mm,
these other stories in there because some of these stories, well, the purpose of these stories actually is to also tell the history of Blacks in America. There are stories about the early days of New Orleans, how certain things came about. There's stories about things in Portland, the
mm,
redlining. There was an incident in 1948, the Vanport flood, which um, it was a flood of the Columbia River, and the all predominantly black neighborhood of Vanport was inundated, and it was a real shameful incident. The city leaders actually knew the levees had broke and decided not to inform the residents and actually made announcements to them to stay in their homes. And it was a really awful thing to do. And they'd already been forced to stay in that area because of redlining. When others were moving out into better, higher ground, blacks were kept in Vanport because it was a very, everything about the town was quite racist. So
mm,
there's all of these little stories. Some of them are fiction, but it really talks about the history of race in America. And I think it's a really crucial part of the book. So I didn't want to take out, it would have been a much shorter book, would have been lot cheaper for me to self-publish, I can tell you that. But, but it's integral, I think, to the story. And it's just part of my process too. And I think that this is what fiction should be about, is these
mm,
stories and opening people's hearts and minds to the lives of other people. And, that some of it is history, some of it is now, but these are human beings. This is like there's a historical progression of things, the impact of racism, how it is carried forward generation after generation. And I try to make that really clear through these
mm,
stories and the
mm.
characters. And using dialogue to me brings the characters alive in a way that just pure description I don't think does. At least that's how I feel when I read dialogue. And the dialogue is very tricky because I also listen to people's accents, and these characters, they all have individual accents. And
Right.
New Orleans especially was tricky because depending on what part of town you're from, you have a different accent than someone. If you're from the Seventh Ward, it's different from the Ninth Ward, or it's different from Mid City. It's just and so keeping that ear open and listening to the nuances and trying to put that down on paper was it's tricky, but I think that adds to bringing characters alive and making them unique. Each individual.
So as you were writing it, for instance, is like as you reread it and you're rewriting it.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you see as you grew up since you let it left? Did your characters end up being growing up?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Oh, yes. There's some real shifts in how they see other people and that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I didn't even really do that purposely. It was what happened as the story unfolded. And, in the early days, like Kitty has this particular view of one of the characters. Their racial divide is very clear. And she's a
Mm,
black woman and she's dealing with this wealthy white woman. And her attitude is, um, a bit disparaging. And then it shifts, everything shifts. It begins to change because these characters, they are beginning to see each other. And yeah, yeah. And I like that part of it too. It was sort of an unexpected, as they say in New Orleans, lagniappe. Just a little bit of
uh,
an extra thing that happened.
and with that said, did you notice as well is that you had a particular direction that you wanted the story to go, but the characters took the story in a different direction that you weren't
Yeah,
planning on as an author?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were certain things that I didn't know what was going to happen, and it just unfolded.
Mm,
Where I did have to, it's a very complex book, so there's a lot of threads that I had to keep together because there's different storylines, and it is a murder mystery. So things have to be resolved and things have to make sense. And if you bring up a situation or bring up something, you need to make sure you get back to it and resolve it, and not just leave it hanging. So I had copious notes, and timelines, and it was really
Huh.
in order to make sure, did I resolve that one? Did that make sense? And so yeah, there was, I mean, different people investigating this, and and yeah, it was definitely. So I didn't actually. I don't know that I really did an outline, which is unusual. I normally do
Huh.
outlines, and this one I had a general idea, and my initial concept of the novel was a little bit different from what ended up happening.
How would you describe this book? Is it a historical fiction? Is it a murder mystery? How would you categorize this?
Wow. I honestly don't know. It's all of those things.
Hmm.
I don't know. It does take place in the 90s, so yes, to some extent, it's historical fiction, but there's so much of it that is now. I mean,
Right.
gentrification continues to happen everywhere, and so much of this relates to what is continuing to go on and what will continue to go on until we understand how these things come about. Um, it's a murder mystery, but that was really more the vehicle to tell this story. It didn't have to be a murder mystery,
Hmm.
but I felt that it was an important thing to do. Actually, it's political, but not in the sense that when we say political novel, we think of like some government intrigue or CIA or something like that. But it's a very
Right.
political in terms of its social outlook. Um, And yes, it's definitely historical in terms of what gay people had to deal with, lesbians and gays had to deal with in the 90s. And, so little things like that. There's a lot of history um, about New Orleans as well, New Orleans and Portland in the 90s. So
Hmm.
it is a difficult one to categorize. But then I it kind of makes sense because when I was at Goddard, everything I was doing was interdisciplinary. So that's how I view the world, as an interdisciplinary person. So I don't know how to kind of stick just with some narrow range of or little tunnel or something. It's
Right.
I see all of these different elements that more holistic view. So telling a story to me has to include a political understanding, a socio-political understanding of the world, especially of what the characters are experiencing or who they are. So yeah, so I think it's a novel. There is definitely, sadly, truth to it.
My next question then for you, Mimi, is what's next?
The next one, well, actually, this particular novel, Kitty Feliz, I do see it as a series, and I've got already an outline, did the outlines for two subsequent novels featuring Kitty Feliz. But I've put that aside and already started work on my next novel, which I really see actually as a novella.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so that's what I've started work on, and it's that is a dystopian,
Okay.
very dystopian novel
Hmm.
or novella. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now for my next project.
And so, how do you like it? The difference between writing fiction and nonfiction. Which one do you find easier for you?
It really depends. This particular one that I've just started, it's actually rather difficult, um, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's very intense, and that makes it difficult. Um, it's not told in the same way. I mean, writing other types of fiction, the short stories that I've done, and Usurpation, the novel, is just a joy to me. I absolutely love it. I'm also a frustrated actor, and so this sort of allows me to dwell in that world, to be an actor, because I become these characters almost. I'm living in it, and it's really quite a glorious experience, which doesn't happen with nonfiction. I feel that the things that I've written are quite important. I love doing research for the nonfiction, but it doesn't kick off the pleasure centers. It doesn't really get my juices going the way creative fiction does. And weird things can happen. There was one particular story in Usurpation that it's something that happened in the early part of the 20th century. It's a story, a family story. And I have no idea where it came from. I remember vividly sitting there in front of my typewriter that day, typing away as if, and it felt to me like someone in my head was dictating this story to me. It just all came out. It was just, I barely thought about it. It was literally like someone was dictating the story to me. It was a very unusual experience. So that doesn't happen with nonfiction.
What about from your nonfiction side? Are you looking at writing a nonfiction book? And if you did, would you use Marie Sampe or would you put Mimi Yahn? Is Mimi Yahn your nonfiction?
No, for my nonfiction, I'm actually slowly switching over to M. Campbell Yahn.
Okay.
So yeah, Mimi Yahn or M. Campbell Yahn, depending on what it is. So yeah, I'm actually going to have 3 names that I'll be writing under. But I want to get back to that article that I had written when Kamala Harris was first became vice president, and I want to update that a little bit and send that out. Called Why the Blackness of Kamala Harris Matters. So I definitely do want to get back to a number of nonfiction things, and I want to rebuild that website that broke because I didn't have time to keep updating. It's just constant updates, and I want to find some site, some web hosting that doesn't require the latest and greatest of everything, doesn't require constant updating. I like things to be simple and, not devote my life to the internet and to computers. Be able to pursue creativity and yeah, it's just
right.
like,
So Mimi, if people want to learn more about you, where's the best place they could go to?
Well, let's see. They can check out my blog, progressiveinstincts.com. They can also look for me, Mimi Yahn, on SoundCloud to hear some of my songs. I haven't uploaded all of them yet, but yeah, political songs, and quite proud of them, actually. And definitely check out my website for Usurpation. So it's Marie Sampe, that's MARIESTEEZ WordPress.com. And I am working on trying to sell it through the website. Right now, it's a little bit complicated because the requirements for being able to sell on the website are beyond my financial ability. So I'm trying to figure out some other ways to sell it. I'm going to probably have to sell it through Instagram and perhaps eBay, that sort of thing. So maybe Facebook, but not sure that Facebook is the best place simply because I worry about security for people who are buying it. And I'm not impressed by how Facebook handles security. People get hacked constantly, and I don't want to jeopardize, people buying the book.
Maybe when you write your dystopian novel or anything else, you got to come back on and we can talk about it.
I'd love to. I'd absolutely love to. Oh, and I should mention that people can go to Amazon or to Barnes & Noble or, of course, Phoenix Books website to get the book. So, yeah, they can order it through there. Yeah. It's available now. So
it's available now. That's right.
Yeah,
yep. And it's, as we mentioned, it's Usurpation, and it is by Marie Sampe. That's the nom de plume for that. And it is available where any place where books are sold. So
yeah. Barney, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure.
I get it, because that's the thing. Because when I got your email and I said it was Mimi Yahn, and then I was like, and then I had to go back up to find out what we went with your nom de plume.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't see. I saw Mimi Yahn's like, yeah, like you said, your blog posts.
Yeah.
There's a thing back in 2015 on 3T Digger, and
Yes.
yeah,
Right.
all that stuff. I'm like, oh
Oh
no, it's
yeah, the investigative reporting about co-ops. Yep. Did not win me too. Definitely won me some enemies. Although I did win friends as a result too. But yeah, that
right,
was
yeah.